So again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the first half is the hardest half. In the second half, we should see some familiar species and species that are just much easier to identify in general. So we're going to start off with the iconic black-capped vireo. So as many of y'all probably know, the black-capped vireo was on the endangered species list up until a couple of years ago. It was delisted back in 2018. This is a sexually dimorphic species. So the males have the black cap, as the species is named for. The females have a gray cap. The males also have this red eye that you can see really well in that picture on the top. And the females do not have that red eye. Aside from that, they have kind of this greenish yellow colored back and body and sides. And they have white wing bars. But probably the thing that stands out the most for them are these white spectacles or glasses. So it looks like they've got that white eye ring that's connected over the top of their nose by a white stripe. So it looks like they're wearing spectacles. One thing I want to point out that's useful for just identifying vireos in general is the beak. So if you notice, their beak has this little hook on the end. And as my ornithology TAs described it to me years ago, it looks like they have like a little crow bill on this tiny bird. So if you see birds that have a little crow bill, that's usually an indicator that you're looking at a vireo. Their song is very vireo-like, if I could describe it like that. It's very nasally sounding. They use a lot of really short notes, and those short notes are really emphatic. A lot of times vireos have that nasal sound and they sound like they have something important to tell you. The black-capped vireo certainly falls in that category. But what sets them apart is how short the notes and phrases are and just how emphatic they are when they say them. So let's listen to that briefly here. So lots of short notes. I do want to point out they make this kind of mewing sound. You can see it kind of right there at the 16-second marker, this mewing sound. We're going to listen to that one more time because we're going to hear it in a sound-alike as well. So I'll back this up a little bit more. So that mew kind of mew sound, that's something we're going to hear in its sound-alike, the wide-eyed vireo. They also have a mnemonic for their song. The mnemonic is drink your tea. Personally, I don't hear this mnemonic, and I'm not a big fan of the drink your tea mnemonic because it's used for a lot of different bird species. But I did want to mention it to y'all just in case it's useful to you. And I did find a recording that I think is supposed to display this drink your tea mnemonic pretty well. So hopefully it'll be helpful, but if not, you are certainly not the only person that doesn't hear it.
LNS catalog number.
So again, still using really short and emphatic notes. I think a few of these phrases where it did like 3 little things, it was supposed to be saying drink your tea, but that's, again, personally one that I don't hear. The sound-alike that you're most likely to run across is the wide-eyed vireo. If you're like me, when I first moved back down to Texas after being away for my undergrad, I thought people were saying wide-eyed, like a really wide like object. As in size. It's actually white-eyed, so don't be confused by the accent. It is a white-eyed vireo. And these guys have a lot of variation in their song, but most of them do some kind of variation on this quick with a beard chick mnemonic. So the recording I'm going to show you right now is the classic quick with a beard chick. If you're lucky, your white-eyed vireo will be saying this. But more often it's going to do some kind of variation or remix on this song. So again, a lot of times they'll kind of remix on that song, or they'll just do like beer chick or quick with the, or sometimes they do quick beer chick, things like that. So I recommend just listening to a bunch of different recordings of them because again, there's a lot of different variation of what their song sounds like. It just usually has a couple of those notes like quick and beer and chick mixed in. Sometimes they'll also do this mewing Z like we heard in the Black Capped Vireo. They tend to make it a lot more like pronounced than the Black Capped Vireo does. And this particular recording is a good example of how they've kind of remixed Quick with the Beer Chick. It still has some of those basic notes in there, but they've interspersed some extra stuff in as well.
LNS catalog number 11.
So again, still kind of that nasally sound, emphatic, but not as many like short all over the place notes like we heard in the Black Capped Vireo. And that wide-eyed vireo is still doing some kind of variation on Quick with the Beer Chick. There are a lot of other vireos that fall within the Oaks and Prairies joint venture. Some of those are like the red-eyed, the yellow-throated, and the Hutton's vireo. I don't want to spend all day on vireo songs, and most of these are unlikely to be in the kind of habitat that you might find black-capped vireos in. But I'd recommend, if you're interested, just go ahead and pull up some recordings of these vireos. Most of them have pretty good mnemonics that are listed in the field guides or in the apps on your phone. But if you have questions about them, feel free to email me as well. And again, most of y'all probably know that black-capped vireos are really only in the Edwards Plateau and that southwestern portion of Oklahoma. But just in case, if you're in East Texas, Eastern Oklahoma, Northern Oklahoma, this is not necessarily a species you need to worry about. Let's talk about one other vireo, the Bell's vireo. So right off the bat, if we look at this vireo, again, it has that little crow bill like we saw in the black-capped vireo. So that's a uniting feature for vireos that you can usually rely on. Bell's vireos are kind of this grayish green color on their back and kind of like a white yellow color on their belly. So another kind of greenish bird, similar to the painted bunting and the olive sparrow, but again, these guys have those white wing bars, and the Bell's vireo has this incomplete eye-ring, which is pretty obvious. So it doesn't have the full spectacles like the black-capped vireo does, but it does have this white eye-ring that's bisected by a gray line. And that's usually pretty obvious when you see the bird. You're usually going to find these guys in a grassland that has some kind of like wet feature. It might be a ditch that has a couple of bushes in the ditch. It might be like a little creek with some trees or bushes down by the creek. Usually they're going to be found in that wet kind of area on the edge of a grassland. Bell's vireo songs are fairly easy. They've got this nasally quality like a lot of vireo songs do, but it's this really angry ascending chatter.
LNS catalog number 11719.
So it always really sounded to me like they were chewing me out for something, just really nasally, angry, ascending chatter. All right, so let's talk about one that most of y'all probably don't need me to talk about, but I'm going to talk about it anyways, just in case we have any newbies in the group. So the northern bobwhite, another sexually dimorphic species, extremely important game species as well. The males are the ones that have the black and white coloring on their head. The females have the more brownish kind of golden color. They do have a really short crest, but you usually don't see it raised. And in flight, I suppose, like if you're inexperienced, it might look a little bit like a dove flying, but these guys look like a baseball or like a softball on wings, and they're not very good at flying. So they're going to usually fly low and just look very not aerodynamic. Their song is also easy. They say their name. I cannot whistle or I would imitate it for you, but they say Bob White. Sometimes they're just going to say Bob. Sometimes they're just going to say White. And sometimes that song is going to be a little bit more screamy than it is whistly. In this particular recording, when the bird says white, it's kind of screamy sounding.
LNS catalog number.
So classic Bob White song. Again, most of y'all probably already knew that one. The one that might be a little bit more obscure for some of y'all is the covey call. So they're typically going to make this song, or this sound that is, around dawn and dusk. We'll play this. So again, not as common a sound that you're going to hear for Bob White, but right around dawn and dusk, you are likely to run across this call if you're in an area with Bob White. For the turkey, similar to the Bob White, I don't have too much to say here other than that it's a turkey. You're not going to run across many other species that look like this other than domestic turkeys. Again, sexually dimorphic species, so not all of them are going to have the fancy headgear or the fancy feathers like the male does. The hens are much more plain. For the sounds, again, most of y'all probably know what the gobble sounds like, but just in case, I'm going to play it. You can listen to it. It's the classic gobble that you hear like right around Thanksgiving. Very easy to identify, iconic sound. You're not going to mistake that gobble with anything else. The one that's a little bit more confusing are the other calls aside from the gobble. The one you're most likely going to hear is the hen call. National Wild Turkey Federation has all of the possible sounds that a wild turkey could make. There's a lot of them, which I didn't realize that there were like all of these calls until I started looking on their website, because I don't have a hunting background, so this is all new to me. They also have videos on how to imitate some of the calls if you're curious. But the one you're most likely to hear is this assembly call. So let's listen to this really quickly. So that's the one you're most likely to hear. Sometimes from a distance, it sounds a bit like someone's cleaning a window, like with some Windex, and they're making like a squeaking sound. And they potentially have a sound alike. So those of y'all that grew up with a hunting background, have spent a lot of time with like game species before, nothing is going to sound like a hen call to you. It's a really unique sound. For those of y'all like me that were relatively new to some of these calls until just, less than 15 years ago, some of this stuff might sound a little bit like a hen. So for those of y'all like me, I put in the green tree frog because it's one that has tripped up my technicians in the past. Again, those of y'all that are used to hen calls, you're going to probably roll your eyes a little bit, but just be aware of this because you might have technicians someday that get really confused and they're talking about a turkey that they heard in the middle of a pond. So again, I'll play the assembly call. Most of us, probably it doesn't sound too much alike, but it's always possible, especially early on when you just start birding, that they sound similar. Okay, so do keep in mind that with the frogs, they are usually going to start off a chorus of frogs, and they're usually going to stay in place. The turkey is going to probably move around a bit. So if you've got a turkey right on the edge of a creek and it's not moving and you can't see it, it's probably a frog. All right, let's talk about the cuckoo, the yellow-billed cuckoo. So these guys are a lot of fun just because their sounds are pretty cool. Visually, they're easy to identify because of this yellow bill, as their name suggests. As far as their color on their back versus the color on the front, there's a really like strong break between those colors. So we go from brown to white. There's no like intermixing in those colors. That can be useful sometimes. They have this rusty patch on their wing that you can see in the photo. You can also see this rusty patch when they're flying. But probably the coolest thing about yellow-billed cuckoos is their tail. And this is something that all cuckoos in the Cuculidae family have. It's these white spots that are at the end of the feathers on the outer edges of their tail. So we call this laddering. There might be some other words that people use for it, but I always called it laddering. And you're gonna see this in all cuckoos. So you're gonna see this in black-billed cuckoos, greater roadrunners, any other cuckoos you might have in your particular geography. As long as they're a true cuckoo in Cuculidae, they're gonna have this kind of ladder pattern. As far as habitat goes, these guys are a grassland species, but they need a couple of trees mixed in. So if you have a grassland that's got a few oak trees in it, they're gonna be in those oak trees, or they're gonna be in the trees along the fence line or the trees down by the creek. So they like that open area, but they want some trees mixed in there somehow. And you're rarely gonna see these birds, you're usually only gonna hear them. And the most common sound that you'll hear is this knocking sound. And it's actually kind of a really creepy sound if you hear it like on a foggy day in the middle of nowhere with nothing else around.
LNS catalog number 109.
And knocking sound, it doesn't really sound anything like a woodpecker. It's got this kind of really hollow quality to that knock. Sometimes they're gonna make this cooing sound. So we'll listen to this really quickly. So again, you'll hear this cooing sound that they make. And it's possible that this cooing might sound a little bit like a greater roadrunner. The roadrunner, when it coos though, it sounds like it's given up on life. It sounds like it's utterly depressed, like nothing is worth living for anymore. One of my friends, I think she's on this call right now, Amanda, described it as like a dog dying kind of sound. So it's just really sad compared to the cuckoo. If we compare that to the cuckoo, it's going to sound a lot happier about life. So that's the greater roadrunner compared to the yellow-billed cuckoo. Another one that's pretty easy to identify visually is the loggerhead shrike. They have this classic robber mask that really stands out when you get them in your binoculars. They just overall have this really kind of pretty black and white and gray pattern on them with these black wings with the white spots on them. It's just a really pretty bird. They're also pretty cool because they have this raptorial bill. So one of the few species where we see that outside of actual like true raptors like eagles and falcons and hawks. And what's even cooler about it is they have a tomial tooth on their upper mandible, which we only see in falcons outside of shrikes. So these are pretty cool guys. If you want to know more about them, I could probably wax poetic for days, and I know for sure that Jim could. He has a bunch of cool photos of them too. And these guys typically are going to be perched in places where it's relatively easy to see them. So they like to be on fences, power lines, the top of a tree, or the top of shrubs. It's possible that if you're looking at a bird that's like really far away on a power line, that mockingbirds can look a little bit like loggerhead shrikes. So just be cautious of that. You know, if you're looking at something 200 meters away on a power line and it's black, white, and gray, and you get excited, it could just be a mockingbird. So make sure you're checking for the robber mask and checking the bill. It's really rare to hear loggerhead shrikes. They do have like a kind of a weird song. It's like these trills and short notes. And it's really rare to hear that. We'll go ahead and listen to it anyways, but just know it's really rare to hear these like trills and notes that make up the loggerhead shrike song. Again, a song that's pretty rare to hear. You're more likely to hear these scolds. So we talked a little bit earlier when we mentioned the wren, that there are a few different kinds of species that typically scold. Wrens, titmice, chickadees, those ones scold. Loggerhead shrikes also scold. And their scold is pretty unique sounding compared to those other species.
Texas Point.
So that's the sound you're more likely to hear, and you usually end up hearing that one when you've gotten too close to the bird and they're fussing at you. Another relatively easy one is the scissor-tail flycatcher. So like their name suggests, they have tails that look like scissors. This is another sexually dimorphic species. So in this photo on the top, the female is the one in the background. She has a shorter tail than the male does. They also have these really pretty peachy sides and armpits. This really light gray head and this really pretty like scalloping pattern on their wings. So just a really pretty bird in general. They'll also perch in places where it's easy to see them. So tops of trees, wires, fences, etc. Kind of like the loggerhead shrike does. Side note too, they're also light enough that they'll perch on like stalks of grass. So make sure when you're like, if you're doing a survey or something, make sure that when you scan the area with your binoculars, you're scanning the tops of grass as well. Their sounds that they make are pretty cute. They sound like a squeaky toy that's raising in pitch. And this is the main song that they make. Again, squeaky toy that's raising in pitch. This is actually one of the first songs that you'll hear in the morning. They're one of the first birds to wake up, so they start up before the rest of the dawn chorus usually does. Sometimes you'll hear scissor-tail flycatchers make like this kind of squeaking and purring sound. So there will be a couple of squeaks and then a squeak followed by a purr in this recording.
LNS catalog number 45.
So squeaks and purrs. And then last but not least, scissor-tail flycatchers are a lot of fun to watch because they have a lot of personality. Sometimes you'll see one of them like fly clear across the field just to pick a fight with their neighbor, and they'll start having this gigantic argument. The males and females have a lot of like little conversations. They'll talk to each other. Family groups tend to be pretty noisy too. And they're one of the first species that'll like chase off a red-tailed hawk or an owl or something like that. I've had multiple reports in the notes of our point counts from different technicians about a scissor-tail flycatcher riding on the back of a red-tailed hawk as it's chasing it away. So Again, that's just a quick example of what it sounds like when they're like talking to each other. It's kind of this jumbled mix of squeaks and purrs and all kinds of stuff. They do have a sound alike. The Western kingbird can sound a bit like them because they're also like a squeaky toy sound. But with the Western kingbird, it's going to have a couple of rising notes followed by some descending notes. So the squeaky toy goes up and then comes back down. So again, squeaky toy that goes up and then back down for the Western kingbird. Scissortail flycatcher just goes up. All right, if you're in Oklahoma, I got a couple more bonus species for you. So the upland sandpiper. This is one of the few sandpipers that you're going to run across in a grassland. They have this kind of long, thin neck with a really tiny head and really big eyes. So those eyes really stand out. They have a little short bill. And if you're looking down on them as they're flying, you can see that the inside of their wing close to their body is paler than the outside of their wing. And if you see them like coming in to land, when they land, a lot of times they'll raise their wings up over their head. Now, as far as lookalikes go, sandpipers are hard, and I'll be the first to admit that this is one of the groups that's probably the most challenging to learn to identify, and I'm definitely not an expert in sandpiper identification. For the most part, since there are relatively few sandpipers in grasslands, you probably don't need to worry about lookalikes too much, but if you are around water features, you're probably going to want to double check just to be sure. So I've got a list here of some things to kind of look out for that can help you pick up sandpiper species, because otherwise we could be here all day just talking about sandpipers alone. So some of the things you want to look for are like the length of the neck. Does the neck have any patterns on it? Does it have an eyebrow or an eye ring of some kind? You know, how long is that bill? Are there like spots or something on the bill or something like that that might be helpful? If you look at the chest and the belly, for example, in the image on the lower left-hand side, we see that the upland sandpiper has like these little Y-shaped marks on its chest. And then the marks stop suddenly. They don't like slowly blend into that white lower belly. They just stop. Those are things to look out for as well. So like what kind of marks does it have? What color are those marks? Does it blend in? Does it sharply stop? And then of course, look at the legs. Like what color are those legs? How long are they? Sometimes even like how knobby the ankles, or most people call them the knees, but they're actually the ankles. How knobby are those? That can be helpful as well. So length, color, pattern, those are the things you want to watch out for with sandpipers. Fortunately, the song for the upland sandpiper is really easy. So they have these downward trills and then this upward trill that will end in a wolf whistle. So this particular recording has examples of both of those. So we'll have two downward trills and then we'll have an upward trill followed by a wolf whistle.
LNS catalog number.
Here comes the upward and wolf whistle. So let's listen to the wolf whistle one more time. So fortunately, a very easy species to identify by sound. And if you're interested in pulling out your Aldo Leopold at some point, I was just rereading mine the other day and I realized that the entire month of May in the Sand Colony Almanac is like a love letter to the upland sandpiper. So if you want to do some fun reading, it's a really short chapter and all he talks about is the upland sandpiper, which he calls the upland plover in that particular chapter. Again, this is a species you only really need to worry about if you are in like the upper panhandle of Texas, the finger of Oklahoma, northern Oklahoma. It's hard to see on this map. There are a couple of patches in western Oklahoma down towards the Red River. So I'd recommend just checking on eBird to see if you have any reports near you. But for the most part, at least for the Oaks and Prairies joint venture geography, it's one we only need to worry about in Oklahoma. And last but certainly not least, we have the greater prairie chicken. So similar to the turkey and to the bob white, there's not too much to say other than that it's a greater prairie chicken. I do want to mention that the top right image is the image that we typically see when people talk about greater prairie chickens. This is not what they look like most of the time. That's what they look like when the males are on the lekking grounds. Usually when you see one outside of lekking, it's going to look like the one in the top left photo with those air pouches deflated and those feathers that they raise up over their head laying down on their neck. The males do look different from the females. So the males are darker and barring than the females are. Unlikely to confuse this with a domestic chicken or like a guinea fowl or something. I just recommend, most of y'all know if you're in an area where you need to think about greater prairie chickens when you're doing surveys and when you're out in the field. So most of y'all probably already know to be on the lookout for them. But if you want to go looking for them, I just recommend double checking before you just call a random chicken that you see in someone's yard a greater prairie chicken. And we'll talk about the sound really quickly. So when the males are booming, it's going to be a really low sound. It almost sounds like the wind or like a ghost or like someone blowing air over the top of a glass bottle. You can miss it if you're not paying attention. So be careful if you're looking for prairie chickens during lekking season that you're really focusing to hear that booming sound. On the graph, it's going to be this line, this kind of static line right at the bottom of the graph. So again, very low sound, easy to miss if you're not paying attention. Okay, and again, as far as their range goes, they're really only going to be up here in northern Oklahoma. Of course, we do have the Atwater's prairie chickens, so those of y'all kind of down in that area, similar to the folks up in northern Oklahoma, you probably know the properties right around the refuge where you need to think about that species. But if you are unfamiliar with that, usually the people in the refuge can tell you, you know, hey, if you tell them, hey, I think I heard something so-and-so miles northeast of the refuge, they'll be able to tell you if there's actually chickens in that area or not. Okay, so do we have any questions? And once we've done a couple of questions, we will do a couple more activities and then wrap up. So any questions, feel free to put them into the chat, or you can come off of mute to ask them as well if you would like. And if there are no questions, that's okay too.